She was tied to a stake as prey for wolves left to die in the frozen Montana wild. But when a lone cowboy refused to walk away, their fates collided in a battle of courage, honor, and survival. If this story moved you, like, subscribe, and tell me, where are you watching from? Let's get started. The Montana wilderness fell silent when Cowboy Luke Harlow heard a faint cry drifting between the tall pines. He paused beside his horse, listening again, unsure if it was the wind or a human voice swallowed by the cold. When the cry came once more, weak, sharp, desperate, Luke followed it, pushing through branches that clawed at his coat. Snow crunched under his boots as he reached a small clearing. What he saw stopped his breath. An Apache woman was tied to a wooden stake, half-frozen, left as prey for wolves. Her hair hung in tangled braids, her chest rising shallowly with each trembling breath. Her wrists were raw and torn from struggling, the rope biting deep into her skin. Snowflakes clung to her lashes as she attempted to lift her head. Her eyes, dark, fierce, defiant, met his with a mix of fear and disbelief. Luke scanned the ground and saw wolf tracks circling, fresh enough to warn him he had little time. He gripped his rifle more firmly, not to frighten her, but because danger prowled just beyond the tree line. He knew whoever did this meant for her to die alone, brutally. And without mercy, Luke holstered his gun slowly so she wouldn't panic, and raised both hands in the universal gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said gently, his voice barely louder than the wind. She didn't speak, only watched him through narrowed eyes, her breathing sharp with pain and caution. But when he took a careful step forward, her trembling eased ever so slightly, an unspoken acceptance that he was not an enemy. Luke's jaw tightened. No person deserved such an end, no matter the tribe, feud, or frontier law that haunted these lands. As he moved closer, the forest shifted with a sound that prickled his skin. A low growl rolled from the shadows. Luke turned just in time to see the first wolf emerge, head lowered, teeth glinting like small ivory blades. The animal circled, testing its prey. Luke drew his knife in one smooth motion and saw he had only seconds to act. His heart pounded, not from fear for himself, but for the battered woman who had no strength left to fight. There was no world where he would walk away and let her die. He sliced the first rope, then the second, working fast while keeping himself between the wolf and the woman. She swayed when the last knot came loose, her knees buckling from cold and exhaustion. Luke caught her before she hit the snow, lifting her with surprising ease. Another growl echoed from behind him. Another wolf had appeared. "Stay with me," he whispered as he guided her backward toward a fallen log where he could defend them better. Her breath brushed his neck, warm but fragile, like a flame close to going out. Without another thought, Luke fired a warning shot into the air. The sound split the wilderness like thunder, sending the wolves retreating into the dark forest, but he knew they would return. They always did. Luke shifted her weight in his arms, noting how light she was, too light for someone who should have been strong. Her lips were blue, her fingers stiff from cold. Survival meant getting her to warmth immediately. He lifted her onto his horse, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. Climbing behind her to hold her steady, they rode through the trees, the air, freezing against Luke's exposed arms as he held her close. Her head rested weakly against his chest, and though she hadn't spoken a word, he felt the trust she was reluctantly granting him. The forest seemed to close around them, branches creaking, the last orange light of day fading into shadows. Luke kept his horse at a slow but steady pace, unwilling to jostle her already battered body. "Just hold on," he murmured. "You're safe now." Her fingers curled faintly against his coat like she wanted to believe him. By the time they reached Luke's small cabin tucked near the base of the ridge, the sun had disappeared completely, leaving only the pale glow of a rising moon. Luke dismounted carefully and carried her inside, kicking the door shut with his boot. He laid her near the hearth and lit a fire with hurried hands. When the flames rose and warmth began to fill the room, her eyelids fluttered. He gently checked her injuries, bruises along her ribs, a swollen ankle, deep rope cuts on her wrists. Nothing life-threatening if treated quickly, but enough to break a weaker spirit. Luke warmed blankets by the fire and wrapped them around her trembling body. She watched him with suspicion at first, as though expecting payment for his kindness. But Luke asked nothing, said nothing besides simple reassurances. He heated water, soaked cloths, and cleaned her wounds with a careful touch. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Only the crackle of the fire and the winter wind against the cabin walls filled the quiet. Luke stole glances at her between tending tasks. She was young, maybe 20, and bore markings of her tribe with quiet pride. Even through the pain, as her body regained warmth, she finally whispered something, her voice barely audible. Luke paused, leaning closer. She repeated her name, Atsa. The name meant something like hawk, if he remembered correctly. It suited her, fierce, wounded, but unbroken. Luke nodded slowly. "I'm Luke," he said softly. She studied his face as though trying to decide what kind of man he truly was. He didn't blame her. Trust came hard out here, especially between worlds divided by war, misunderstanding, and bloodshed. But he hoped tonight might be the start of something different, at least for the two of them. When she tried to sit up, pain rippled through her body as she gasped sharply. Luke was at her side in an instant, steadying her. "Easy," he murmured. "You've been through hell." Her eyes softened just a little at the gentleness in his tone. She leaned back against the fur blanket, exhausted. Outside, distant, howls echoed through the valley, the wolves returning to where they'd expected a meal. Luke tossed another log into the fire, knowing the night would be long and dangers still lingered. But he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not let anything take her again. As Atsa drifted into uneasy sleep, Luke sat in the chair beside her, watching the fire cast shifting shadows on her face. He wondered who had tied her to that stake. A rival tribe? A cruel outlaw? Someone she trusted who turned on her? Questions gnawed at him, but answers could wait until she had the strength to speak them. All he cared about now was the rise and fall of her, breathing steadier now, stronger than when he'd found her. She had fought to survive, and now he would fight to keep her alive. A quiet promise settled inside him. Before sleep claimed him, Luke glanced out the window at the moonlit trees. Somewhere out there, danger prowled, waiting for weakness. But they would find none here. Not while he lived. Luke laid his hat on the table and looked back at the woman whose fate had collided with his in one brutal winter night. He didn't know why destiny had placed her in his path, but he felt it deep certain that rescuing her was only the beginning of a story far larger than either of them understood. And whatever that story became, he would not turn away. Luke carried her through the thickening darkness, the wind slicing cold across his face as he searched for safer shelter. His cabin was too far, and the wolves too close. He moved steadily, cradling Ayana against his chest as though protecting a fragile ember from being extinguished. At last, tucked between the pines, he found an old trapper's cabin, weathered, leaning, half forgotten by time. He kicked the door open, laid her gently on a pile of old furs, and lit a fire. As warmth filled the cramped room, her trembling eased. For the first time since he'd found her, she truly breathed. The night stretched long, the wind howling like a wounded beast outside the cabin walls. Luke checked her wounds again, washing dried blood from her legs and wrists with warm water. She winced at the sting, but didn't pull away. When her strength returned enough to form words, she whispered her name, Ayana. The sound carried a weight, a story she hadn't yet spoken. Luke nodded, giving her space to unfold it at her own pace. He cooked a small pot of broth, feeding her carefully, watching color slowly return to her cheeks as the hours crawled by. At last, when the moon rose high and the fire crackled low, Ayana began to speak. Her voice was soft but steady, shaped by pain and stubborn courage. She told him about the outlaw white drifter with cruel eyes who wanted her as if she were a prize he could claim. When she refused him publicly, he tied her to the stake as punishment, leaving her to the wolves to silence her defiance. Luke's jaw clenched, fury boiling beneath his steady exterior. But he stayed quiet, letting her story come out without interruption. Offering her the silence she needed, Ayana paused often, staring into the flames as if seeing ghosts inside them. Luke realized she was not afraid of death. She had faced it too closely to fear it now. What she feared was cruelty, dominance, the kind of violence that sought to break a spirit, not just a body. When she finished her story, Luke placed another log on the fire and sat beside her. "Nobody should have to stand against men like that alone," he said quietly. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw gratitude, raw, hesitant, but real. The kind that begins to mend a wound. They slept lightly, exhaustion pulling them into a restless, fragile peace. Luke woke before dawn, instincts prickling like needles along his spine. He listened, breath held. Then he heard it. Faint hoofbeats in the distance, multiple riders moving with purpose. The same kind of men who would leave someone to die tied to a stake. Luke rose, checked his rifle, and tucked Ayana's knife beside her furs. "Stay inside," he whispered. She shook her head, but he touched her shoulder gently. "Just until I know what we're facing." She relented. Though he knew she hated the idea of hiding, Luke stepped outside just as the sun began to brush gold across the tops of the trees. 4 riders approached, silhouettes dark against the pale morning sky. Their horses snorted clouds of vapor in the cold air. Luke stood tall in front of the cabin door, rifle loose in his hand but ready. When the riders reached speaking distance, the man in front, broad-shouldered, wearing a wolfskin coat, leaned forward in his saddle. "We're looking for a runaway," he drawled. "Apache woman?" "Dangerous one." Luke didn't blink. "Ain't nobody here but me." The man smiled without warmth. "We'll see about that." The riders fanned out, circling the cabin like wolves around a wounded animal. Luke kept his stance steady, even as tension thickened the air. "She ain't your concern," he said, voice calm, but the steel beneath it unmistakable. "And she sure as hell ain't going back with you." The outlaw leader narrowed his eyes. "You don't know what she did?" Luke tightened his grip on the rifle. "I know what you did?" A flicker of surprise crossed the outlaw's face. Luke's confidence, his refusal to yield, wasn't something he expected from a lone cowboy in the snow. The men muttered uneasily. Just when it seemed violence was about to break loose, the cabin door creaked behind him. Luke turned slightly and saw Ayana standing there. Her hair was loose, framing her bruised face. Her breath trembled, but her posture was unbroken. She stepped forward, barefoot on the snow, each step a declaration. "I choose my own fate," she said, her voice ringing through the clearing. The riders stiffened, shocked that she could still stand, let alone speak. Ayana moved until she stood beside Luke, shoulders aligned with his, as if they had been fighting battles together all their lives. The outlaw leader sneered. "You think standing next to that cowboy changes anything?" Ayana lifted her chin. "It changes everything." Her voice carried the power of someone who had come through fire and still walked proudly. Luke felt something shift in the air, an invisible line drawn between justice and cruelty, freedom and fear. The riders sensed it too. One muttered, "Chief ain't gonna like this," to which another whispered, "We ain't paid enough to fight both of them." The outlaw leader glared. Realizing control was slipping from his grasp faster than snow melting on warm skin, Luke didn't raise his rifle. He didn't need to. Something about the woman beside him, her defiance, her raw strength, was more threatening than any bullet he could fire. The men exchanged uncertain glances. Their courage wavered. Wolves knew when a hunt had turned against them. One by one, the riders backed away, spooked by the unspoken force they sensed. The leader spat into the snow but said nothing. He jerked his reins sharply, turned his horse, and rode off. The others followed, disappearing into the trees, their shapes swallowed by the forest like ghosts retreating from dawn. Ayana watched them vanish, her shoulders finally sagging with exhaustion. Luke exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. When he turned to her, she was studying him with an expression that was softer than anything she had shown before, gratitude mixed with something deeper, something that warmed him more than the rising sun. "You saved my life," she whispered. Luke tipped his hat, a faint smile touching his lips. "You saved mine too," he said, "back there at the stake. You made me remember what kind of man I aim to be." She looked at him differently then, as if seeing him not as a stranger, but as a turning point in her fate. They returned to the cabin as sunlight flooded the clearing. melting frost from the roof and painting the world gold. Inside, Luke wrapped her wounds again, and this time she didn't watch him with suspicion, but with trust. Not forced, not fragile, real trust. When she rested, he brewed tea and prepared food, moving around the cabin with a quiet gentleness that made the space feel like a sanctuary instead of a shelter. Ayana's fingers brushed his wrist once, lightly, intentionally. Neither spoke of it, but the moment lingered like warmth in the cold. Two lives, once separate, now quietly woven together. As the day stretched forward, Luke stepped outside and looked toward the horizon. No riders, no wolves. Just the endless, wild Montana sky. Ayana joined him, leaning lightly on his arm for support. "What now?" she asked. Luke glanced at her, at the courage in her eyes, at the strength that had carried her through unspeakable cruelty. "Whatever you choose," he said. "If you want to stay, there's room. If you want to ride on, I'll see you safe." Ayana's lips curved into a small, honest smile. "Then I choose to stay for now." It was enough. It was everything, and so the cowboy who refused to walk away from a stranger, and the woman who refused to bow to her tormentors, began a new story in the snow-covered wilderness. A story written not by fate or fear, but by choice. By dawn, they were no longer just survivor and rescuer, they were partners in a world where survival was easier when two hearts beat in the same direction. And though neither spoke the word aloud, something unmistakable sparked between them, brighter than the fire that warmed the cabin, stronger than the winter wind that tried to tear them apart.